So why this conversation? Since 1967, Israel has incarcerated 800,000 Palestinians, no less than 20% of the Palestinian population, limited to the occupied West Bank and Gaza. Today, in captivity, there are 5,224 Palestinians, including 21 women, 83 administrative detainees, and 210 children, 34 of whom are under the age of 16, and notably, Israel considers Palestinian children to be those that Palestinian children can include those up to the age of 18, unlike the application of its own laws to its Israeli children. Among Palestinians, jail is a very normalized part of life, as normal and as common as school, as babies, as olive oil and thyme. There is no stigma to it, because the crimes for which Palestinians are locked up in cold, distant cells are crimes of resistance. Resistance to oppression, to subjugation, to humiliation, and the degradation of land and family. To Palestinians, they are all political prisoners, and they are prisoners for whom we sing songs. من سجن عكا طلعت جنازي محمد جمجوم وفؤاد حجازي جازي عليهم يا شعبي جازي مندوب السامي وربعه عمومة. The funeral procession set out from Akka prison for Muhammad Jamjoom and Fuad Hijazi. Oh, how they punish them, my people. Oh, how the High Commissioner and his people punish them. This is a chorus for a song dedicated to 3 Palestinian martyrs resisting British and Zionist colonial domination in the 1930s. It's a gruesome story that's been romanticized and encapsulates the Palestinian condition. Palestinians know that the criminal system is an unjust system, and we must know that too. We cannot take the criminal system at face value. Our prisons, from Palestine to Saudi Arabia to China and the United States, are not filled with bad people who have done bad things. Criminal law, more than any other type of law, represents the moral compass of society. And rather than punishing what causes the greatest harm to society, it punishes what society considers the most abhorrent. That's why across 14 states, including Texas, Idaho, Oklahoma, and Virginia, sodomy was illegal until 2003. And meanwhile, in California, same-sex marriage became legal as early as 2008. That's why in Ann Arbor, Michigan, you can walk around and smoke a joint publicly. But in Louisiana, you can be imprisoned for up to 20 years for mere possession of marijuana. Criminal law does not represent what will harm us most. Criminal law represents what is the greatest risk to those in power. And for Palestinians, those in power represent an ethos of settler colonialism. Upon its establishment, Israel passed a series of laws that privileged its Jewish inhabitants and further dispossessed and marginalized its non-Jewish, indigenous, Christian, and Palestinian population. The Citizenship Law of 1952 and the Law of Return of 1950 ensured that Jewish persons who lived beyond Israel's boundaries and had no relationship to it had more rights than the state's own Palestinian citizens. The new state was cementing its Jewish demographic majority that its Zionist founders thought necessary to preserve Israel's Jewish character. By instituting a series of similar laws, it also preserved Jewish political, social, and economic privilege. The purpose of these laws has been to ensure that Palestinians are a minority, an underclass, and a fragmented population within its society. Israel's policies aim to diminish the Palestinian population, to geographically concentrate them into separated ghettos, and to erase their presence physically and metaphysically in an effort to uphold a national mythology regarding its establishment and existence. Between 1948 and 1966, Israel imposed emergency laws within its non-declared borders. Israel has never declared its borders to this day. That's why saying the 1967 borders is so blasphemous. So it's non-declared borders. And it imposed emergency law upon its Arab citizens, the 100,000 Palestinians who didn't flee in the course of Plan Dalit or the 1948 war, the Palestinian Nakba, the Palestinian population who now constitute approximately 1.3 million of Israel's population, or 20% of its population, not including those in the West Bank and Gaza. It imposed this emergency law, which is the law that allows a government to conduct itself by force rather than consent. It imposed it upon its non-Jewish citizens only up until 1966, because it prepared for the imposition of that law upon the Palestinian population in the occupied territories in 1967 to this present day. This emergency law is derivative of a British colonial administration. Historically, the British Empire applied emergency law to suppress rebellion and self-determination amongst native peoples from Kenya to Malaya to British Guyana and Mandate Palestine. And while other countries like Egypt and Syria have applied emergency law for decades, the moniker for the longest lasting imposition of this law goes to the only democracy in the Middle East. A matrix of 1,500 military laws exists in the occupied territories. They can be changed arbitrarily without notice, applied retroactively, in violation of the most basic tenet of criminal law, nullum crimen sine lege, or no crime and no punishment where there was no applicable law prohibiting it. But this does not matter to Israel, where the law is designed to further settler colonial expansion. Thus, it is illegal for Palestinians to drive on Israeli-only roads. It is illegal to build homes without permits that are systematically denied. It is illegal to commemorate the Nakba within Israel. It is illegal to build ties with Palestinians and Arab throughout the surrounding Middle East and Arab world, as was just the case with 23-year-old journalist Majid Kayali, who has been charged with treason, given a gag order, and now held under house arrest. It is illegal for Palestinians from Gaza to study at Birzeit University, Najah University, Abu Dis University in the West Bank because of an infiltrator's law. It is illegal to go fishing beyond 3 nautical miles off of the Gaza coast, where fishermen would fish to feed their families and to have a livelihood, in contravention of basic human rights, as well as the 2012 ceasefire agreement. It is illegal for Palestinian citizens of Israel to marry a Palestinian from so-called enemy states, and including the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and to acquire residency for them in their homes of Haifa, Yafa, Akka, Safad, Bisan, Tarshiha, al-Fahm, and the rest of Israel and its non-declared borders. It is illegal to worship as a Muslim in the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem if you are not among the few who have Jerusalemite ID or Israeli citizenship. It is illegal to reach the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, as Palestinian Christians have been denied that right this weekend, this Easter, and the last 9 Easters, and in every day of their lives this year and in the indefinite years to come. Given Israel's desire to control the most land with the least Palestinians, together with its arbitrary matrix of military and discriminatory law, the question is not why so many Palestinians, 800,000 since 1967, have been held in captivity, but why so many have not. And the truth is that they are all held in captivity, being denied self-determination and the right to choose freely one's own economic, cultural, social, and political future is being held in captivity, whether in the open-air prison in the Gaza Strip, whether in forced exile throughout the 58 refugee camps in the Arab world and in the global diaspora, or whether as impediments to Israel's hegemony the world over. Israeli prison cells are simply one and amongst the most visceral of this multi-layered captivity. In the US, where settler colonialism is ongoing, and where we have yet to mourn the institution of slavery as a nation and to issue even nominal monetary reparations for those crimes against humanity, our criminal system is no different. Our laws criminalize poverty, and our police forces disproportionately patrol communities of color. Of course, communities of color will be disproportionately represented in prisons when that's where we place our police. Of course, Muslims and Arabs will be subject to FBI investigations of terrorism when that's who the FBI targets. Over the last 30 years, the US penal population has risen from approximately 300,000 to over 2 million, the majority of which consists of drug convictions. 3/4 of all people imprisoned for drug offenses are Black and Latino, despite the majority of drug users and dealers being white. Native Americans only constitute 1.2% of the US's population, and yet are incarcerated at a rate of 38% greater than the national average. In 2010, African Americans who are systematically excluded from the formal labor market had the highest poverty rate in over half a century. 27.4% of African Americans made less than $11,139 a year. That is criminal. And yet, 1 out of every 15 African American males is locked up in prison in comparison to 1 out of every 106 white Americans. And this, by the way, is to say nothing of the way that we criminalize our immigrant population, who suffer both for economic and national vulnerability. But these laws do not simply punish certain populations, they dehumanize them. In February 2012, a young unarmed boy was fatally gunned down. In July 2013, a jury acquitted his shooter, citing that he had the right to self-defense. The judgment makes no sense. 17-year-old Trayvon Martin was unarmed, save for a bag of Skittles. Its most deadly ingredient was its high fructose corn syrup. But the jury agreed that George Zimmerman experienced reasonable fear at the sight of a Black child in a hoodie. A reasonable enough fear to use a lethal weapon to fatally shoot this boy at close proximity. And in this tragedy, we learned again, and were reminded again, that self-defense doesn't belong to everybody, that the right to victimhood is an exclusive right that doesn't belong to everybody. Last summer, I co-led an interfaith Peace Builders delegation, you should all join one, where we met David Wilder, head of the Hebron Settlement Council and a US-born Jewish man from Cleveland. Hebron, if you don't know, El Khalil, is the site of the most extreme forms of tangible violence. The settler movement began to colonize it in 1967 in what they regard as their homecoming. They're ideologically motivated and are more committed to being on the land which they believe belongs to them by divine decree than they are to the state of Israel. And unlike other settlements which are built on hilltops so that settlers and the army can surveil Palestinians, in Hebron, the settlement is built straight in the middle of the Palestinian community, creating a donut hole, terrorizing the Palestinians who live there. In response to a question about Baruch Goldstein, the Israeli settler who killed 29 Palestinians as they prayed at the Ibrahimi Mosque in 1994, David explained, quote, "You can count on one or two hands the Jews who have used violence that was not in self-defense." In contrast, Isa Amro, a Palestinian youth leader of Youth Against Settlements, like all other Palestinians, does not have a state, does not have an international force, does not have an army, does not have weapons, does not have anyone to protect him. Settlers physically assault, spit on, and expose themselves to Isa Amro and children and Palestinians in Al-Khalil as Israeli soldiers watch on. The army does intervene, but only if Palestinians react in any way. Then the soldiers detain the Palestinians and not the settlers. Isa explains, quote, "I am nonviolent. I am a nonviolent activist, but I believe in defending myself. The problem is that I cannot." Isa is not eligible to experience reasonable fear. He will never be able to exercise self-defense under the current matrix of law. He is always the looming threat. Amongst Americans, and certainly those in the Beltway, where I've lived, unfortunately, for a long time, this couldn't be farther from the truth. Let me tell you a little bit more about the conditions of settler violence, which is not prosecuted. Settlers, there's an average of 1 attack by settlers on Palestinians every day. In 2013, there were 399 attacks. On November 14th, 2013, in one of the most gruesome attacks, at 2 a.m., 2 settler men approached the home of Ruwaida and Khalid Dar Khalil, where they slept with their 5 children. The settler men poured gasoline onto the porch and threw a Molotov cocktail through the window. They firebombed the home. The fire blocked the door, and the entire family had to rush to the rooftop to obtain shelter. They survived, as the Palestinian Fire Department did come, but those settler men have never been prosecuted for that crime. And in fact, that's the norm. In the past 10 years, the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel documented 700 complaints by Palestinians about settler violence. And of those 700 complaints, 700 went without a criminal investigation. There is impunity that's afforded by the state for these settlers to attack. And in fact, soldiers stand idly by until Palestinians attacked, and then they are incarcerated. But Israeli troops don't even need a reason to incarcerate Palestinians. Under the military law I spoke of, Israel can arbitrarily detain Palestinians, imprison them for up to 6 months without charge or trial, renewable every 6 months indefinitely. Imagine the denial of habeas corpus that we've protested vehemently in Guantanamo Bay. Imagine that that's applied to Palestinians for over 60 years. In the case of Iyad Dudin, he has been imprisoned for up to nearly 5 years now. His sentence renewed 30 times. 183 Palestinians are in administrative detention today. And the reason they're detained without charge or trial is not because they've done something wrong, but because they become subjects of interrogation. Interrogation where Israel practices torture systematically. Since 1967, Israel has tortured to death 73 Palestinians in its custody. The most recent among these was Arafat Jaradat, a 30-year-old man who wasn't incarcerated for more than 70 days before he died as a result of torture. Israel doesn't even bother to use the euphemism, enhanced interrogation techniques. It says we torture in the name of national security, and national security specifically for its Jewish citizens. And after 66 years of ongoing Israeli subjugation, the risk of accepting these conditions as natural is severely high. Doing so would accept Israel's national security narrative and reify the absurd human rights atrocities that plague Palestinians in particular and all of humanity in general. But Palestinians have not waited for anyone to save them. Palestinian political prisoners in April 2012 used the one thing they had at their disposal to resist this condition. They used their own bodies in a massive hunger strike. On April 17, 2012, 2,500 Palestinian political prisoners engaged in a massive hunger strike. They asked for the most basic things: the right to a higher education, the right to medical care, the right to family visits, the right to purchase items from canteens, the right to know what the charges against them were or to be released. Thaer Halahle was one of these hunger strikers. On his 73rd day of his hunger strike, his gums and his lips were bleeding. He reached 121 pounds. 4 days later, the Israeli prison authorities let him out. But during his captivity, he wrote a letter to his 1-year-old daughter who he had not met yet. And he wrote, "My beloved Lamar, forgive me because the occupation took me away from you, and from the pleasure of witnessing my firstborn child that I have always prayed to God to see, to kiss, to be happy with. It is not your fault. This is our destiny as Palestinian people to have our lives and the lives of our children taken away from us. Lamar, my love, that day will come when I am free, and I will make it up to you for everything and tell you the whole story, and your days that will follow will be more beautiful. So let your days pass now, and wear your prettiest clothes. Run, and then run again in the gardens of your long life. Go forward and forward, for nothing is behind you but the past. And this is your voice I hear all the time as a melody of freedom." Israel rearrested Thaer. I'll clap for him as well, yes. Israeli officials rearrested Thaer on April 10th, 2013. This is his 8th time in prison. He's spent 6.5 years now in captivity, not a single charge filed against him. But this is common practice. For all the talk that we've been hearing about prisoner release in this current peace process, Israel can release and rearrest Palestinians at will. That's what an occupying force can do. That's what an apartheid regime can do. Palestinians can't arrest a single Israeli, certainly can't arrest the settlers that attack them, certainly can't protect themselves against those who harm them. Since 1967 and 1993 and 2013, so between the start of the peace process and last year, Israel released about 26,000 Palestinian political prisoners as a gesture of goodwill and has rearrested 86,000 in that same period. Palestinians will continue to resist, as they have resisted and as they have inspired us. But the truth is, even when they're released from their cold, distant, concrete prison cells, released back into their homes in Ramallah and Nablus, in Gaza City and Rafah, they are still not free. No Palestinian will be free until the entirety of this apartheid regime is dismantled. And Palestinians are certainly committed to this, and I've asked you all to commit with them as well in their 2005 call for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israeli apartheid, colonialism, and settler colonialism and occupation. And most relevant to this discussion is the target of G4S, a private security company that profits off of the incarceration of every additional person, from Palestine to Australia to Brazil and beyond. G4S our bodies are their bottom line. And so the campaign now is against them. And only 2 days ago, the Boycott National Committee has asked, especially those in the United States, especially you, to press on the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which owns $170 million worth of stock in G4S, to divest their holdings, to divest those holdings. So I urge you all to join that, to answer that call, to join that campaign, to sing along to the melody of Tha'ir's daughter, Lamar. I urge you all to raise your voices in freedom. Let's free all of our political prisoners at home. Let's free ourselves from corporate greed and domination. Let's free our people who should have never been locked up, and let's free Palestine. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Noura. You're a hard act to follow yourself. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. This is certainly one of the high points of my political trajectory, to be able to be here with the Rachel Corrie Foundation and engage in a discussion about an issue which has claimed my passion and my activism for more than a half century. So let me thank Cindy and Craig Corrie, the Rachel Corrie Foundation, and all of the people involved in sponsoring this amazing conference. But let me say that this kind of gathering, this conference, this theme is precisely what we need at this moment to make it possible for progressive people in this country to seriously talk about and act against the occupation of Palestine, and to place the carceral practices of the state of Israel within the context of the global prison industrial complex, which means that when we talk about mass incarceration in the US, we need to be able to explore the connections with the mass political incarceration of Palestinians by the state of Israel. And I think this is especially important given the fact that Palestinian Prisoners' Day was, 2 days ago? Right. I think this is a moment when it is possible in this country to generate increasing support for BDS. Right now, at this very moment, the Asian American Studies Association is meeting in San Francisco. And if you did not know, they were the first academic association to pass a resolution calling for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. And they were followed, as many of you know, by the American Studies Association. And those of us who are well, I'm a member of ASA and worked toward the passage of the resolution in the ASA. But many of us who are members of other academic professional organizations are hard at work attempting to guarantee that this will become a trend. I am really sorry that I wasn't able to attend the workshops. I was speaking at Pacific University last night, and I was not able to hear the workshops. From looking at the titles of the workshops and the descriptions, they must have been really fascinating and insightful. Political prisoners, of course, but I see that there was a workshop on the school-to-prison pipeline, on immigrant detention, and of course, immigrant detention is the most profitable sector of what we call the prison industrial complex, not only here, but in other parts of the world as well. Solitary confinement, prisoner hunger strikes from Palestine to Pelican Bay. When I looked at the description of all of the workshops, it struck me that somehow we need to pass this on as a model to people in other parts of the country so that they can hold conferences and meetings that explore these connections. We can no longer afford to treat the use of carceral strategies by the State of Israel and the use of carceral strategies by the United States as entirely unrelated issues. At the same time that we acknowledge the contextual differences, we need to point out that the same technologies are employed and that in many instances the same corporations profit from the sale of these technologies to the two governments. More generally, of course, we know that if it were not for the aid provided by the U.S. to the tune of some $3 billion a year, the occupation could not continue. The U.S. provides what amounts to over 1/5 of Israel's entire military budget. So certainly, before we even begin to explore the intersections between the two countries' practices of mass incarceration, we see how deeply the U.S. is implicated in the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Why do so many people assume that the government of Israel must be considered immune to substantive critique? And of course, it is because of the emotional connection people are urged to make between the Holocaust and Israel as the only viable haven for Jews. It's often assumed that we cannot say never again without supporting Israel. But the violence that claimed the lives of so many Jews during the Holocaust is not unrelated to racist violence, to settler colonial violence in the U.S., in South Africa, in Australia, in Europe. And it seems to me that just as we claim the right to stand up to governments all over the world, and just as we claim the right to stand up to the U.S. government, even, and perhaps especially the United States government of the Obama era, we should join increasing numbers of Israeli citizens, Jewish and Arab, in standing up to the state of Israel. As Noura pointed out, something like 800,000 Palestinians have been subjected to imprisonment since 1967. If we look at the United States, we can see that there are almost 2.5 million people in U.S. state and federal prisons, but we add to the prisons also the county jails and the military prisons and the jails in Indian country and also the immigrant detention centers. Michelle Alexander has pointed out that there are more black men in prison and under the direct control of correctional agencies today, in the second decade of the 21st century, than there were enslaved in 1850. Now that's a pretty, sometimes statistics are, can be manipulated and they're confusing, and people, do all kinds of weird things with statistics. And at the same time, it's often assumed that that's the only real knowledge that there is. And I think we use the statistics, but we also point out that the knowledge comes from elsewhere. But that's a pretty dramatic contrast, isn't it? In the US, of course, here in this country, we tend to separate political prisoners from the vast numbers of prisoners whose bodies constitute fuel for profit for the prison industrial complex. I can tell you that many years ago, when I was arrested, and that was before a lot of you were born, it was in 1970, what we attempted to do was to trouble that what appeared to be a distinction that was too clear between political prisoners and criminals, right? Of course, I was considered a political prisoner, even though I was arrested on 3 criminal charges. I was charged with murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy, all of which were capital charges at the time. So I was charged with the death penalty 3 times, which is really bizarre that they think they can send you to what was at that time the gas chamber 3 times. But at that time, there were many other political prisoners, some of whose names you may recognize. Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, Erica Huggins, other members of the Black Panther Party, young people who were involved in Latino organizations such as the Young Lords or the Brown Berets. There was the campaign on the West Coast, for example, around Los Siete de la Raza. And I should point out that there are people who are still in prison from that era. As a matter of fact, my co-defendant, Ruchell McGee, observed the 50th anniversary of his imprisonment as we were observing the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington and the Birmingham Campaign, etc. Mando Waylanga, David Poindexter, Veronzo Bowers, and of course Leonard Peltier, who was one of the longest held political prisoners in this country. And then Mumia Abu-Jamal, who was arrested later, but has still spent decades of his life on death row before he was recently placed in the main population. Now, during the era of the 70s, we began to think about the connection between political prisoners, those who were arrested for having been involved in political acts or because of their political affiliation, the connection between political prisoners and those who were politicized while they were in prison and therefore came to be subjected to yet another level of repression. George Jackson, for example, the Soledad brothers are good examples of the ways in which people who were considered to be criminals became politicized. And then thanks to the ways in which prisoners like George Jackson began to analyze the situation of people in prison at that time, we came to recognize that most people in prison were there because of the racist and political function of the criminal justice system. And of course, the best example of what we might call the structural racism of the criminal justice system, and Noura already referred to that, are the racial disparities in drug arrests and drug convictions and drug sentencing. And according to the NAACP, 5 times as many white people use drugs as black people. Yet black people are sent to prison for drug offenses at 10 times the rate of white people. And here are a couple of more statistics. African Americans represent 12% of the total population of drug users, which is about the population, the percentage of the main population. But 38% of those arrested for drug offenses, and 59% of those in state prison for a drug offense. African Americans serve virtually as much time in prison for a drug offense, 58.7 months, this is the NAACP still, as whites do for a violent offense, which is 61.7 months. Now, this racial disparity represents an example of the structural racism that is a political feature that pervades the criminal justice system from the level of law enforcement to correctional agencies. So even those who are labeled political prisons, who are not labeled political prisoners, are, for the most part, in prison because of a set of political conditions that are responsible for the continued existence of racist strategies and ideologies. As Frederick Douglass said many, many years ago, crime is imputed to color. Crime is imputed to color. He was referring then to the criminalization of slaves and then former slaves. Now, if we kind of fast forward to the present and we think about the emergence of what we call a prison industrial complex as the consequence of the privatization of human resources and the deindustrialization of the economy and the dismantling of the welfare state, one can say that the incarceration of so many youth of color in this country is a dramatic indication of the failure of U.S. society. Instead of encouraging young Black, Latino, Native American people, this is actually true of poor youth of all racial and national backgrounds, instead of discouraging them to dream of a democratic future. They stamp them as surplus populations. They are not needed. So there will be no schools for them. Or if there are schools, there will be schools that emphasize punishment, discipline and punishment, and testing. Testing is a part of the discipline punishment process. And in a sense, it seems to me, given the fact that there have been amazing examples of young people, children, participating in mass movements. If you look at the movement of the 60s in the South, that was young people. And as a matter of fact, in Birmingham in 1963, there was a children's crusade where children got arrested and were attacked by Bull Connor's dogs and by high-power fire hoses, and they kept coming back. This is a movement about which we don't hear a great deal today. You think that it was Dr. King who did all of the major work to bring about a change. And I think about the fact that in occupied Palestine today, children are arrested in the middle of the night and are interrogated without the presence of lawyers or parents. And it seems to me that this is an indication of the fragility of the hold of the state of Israel over the Palestinian people. Prison is a fact of life for many people. People here in the US, and especially Black people, Latinos, Native and Asian American communities targeted by police, poor white people as well, can identify this process of criminalization. Virtually, I think probably almost every Black person in this country, even someone like Clarence Thomas, the ones who Martin Luther King said had climbed out of the swamps on the shoulders of their sisters and brothers and failed to look back and failed to realize how they got out of the swamp in the first place. Even they have direct or indirect connections to prison, a family member or a friend who has been in prison. And as I said when I spoke last year at an observance of Palestinian Prisoners' Day, here in the US with 2.5 million people behind bars, it has never occurred to us to have a Prisoners' Day. I mean, I think we can learn so much from the Palestinian struggle. Of course, in Palestine, virtually every prisoner in an Israeli jail is a political prisoner. And the small minority who might not be arrested for explicitly political acts quickly become political once they meet their brothers and sisters behind bars. As much as Israel would like to pretend that the occupation of Palestine is working well, the numbers of prisoners indicate that the occupation can only be managed by means of violence and repression. When I traveled to Palestine in the summer of 2011 with a delegation of women of color and indigenous feminist scholar activists, it was actually the first trip for all of us. But all of us had been involved for many years in Palestine solidarity work. We were all totally shocked by the egregious and visible nature of the repression. The Israeli military made no attempt to conceal or mitigate the violence they were inflicting on Palestinian people. Gun-toting military men and women were everywhere. I remember saying that I was in South Africa before the downfall of apartheid. I didn't violate the boycott. I was invited by the ANC to come. And I also had traveled to Northern Ireland at one of the most difficult periods. And I said that neither place was as bad as what I witnessed in occupied Palestine. On our delegation, there were people who had grown up in South Africa, and people who had grown up on Indian reservations, people who had grown up in the Jim Crow South, and everybody had exactly the same reaction. The wall, the concrete, the razor wire, as Noura said, those are the technologies of imprisonment that is transferred from the prison to the larger community. We were already in prison. But of course, I still cannot get the image of these young Israeli kids walking around with these huge weapons with their fingers on the trigger all the time. It was really scary. And then, of course, in Hebron, also walking through the marketplace and looking up and seeing an Israeli soldier with his gun aimed directly at you. So, yeah. We could not help expressing absolute shock that we had not realized that in so many respects it was worse than South African apartheid, worse than Jim Crow racism. We realized that the carceral technologies that we have seen in maximum and super maximum security prisons here in the US were very much at use in the so-called free world, which was clearly not free. Virtually everyone we met had either been in prison or had family members and friends who had been in prison. And there are many figures that are proposed to indicate how many Palestinians have been arrested since the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza began in 1967. Between 750,000 and 1 million Palestinians have been arrested. 800,000 is the figure that people usually give. And that's 20% of the population. That's 40% of the male population. That is why virtually everyone has a direct connection to someone in prison or who has been in prison. And this is also why I believe Palestinians have such great respect for those behind bars. Because historically, much of the leadership of the resistance has come from prison. I think we here in the US can learn a great deal from our sisters and brothers in Palestine. We can learn from their dedication, from their perseverance, from their optimism. We can learn from their belief in the power of education. I was so totally impressed to learn that the literacy rate is over 90%. Even though the Israeli prison service provides only a negligible number of teachers. The prisoners themselves teach classes. And this, of course, is a long tradition from Gramsci, Mandela, etc. Education and liberation are inseparable. The Palestinians know this better than anyone else. And I think we here in the US need to relearn that lesson about the connection between education and liberation. During the last part of my talk, I want to follow what Noura pointed to and spend a few minutes talking about G4S, because this is an important campaign. And we know that there are quite a number of transnational corporations that have been identified as targets of the boycott. Veolia, for example. I don't know if you have Super Shuttle up here. You do? Okay, yeah. So don't use Super Shuttle anymore. And of course, as a result of, who was it? Scarlett Johansson, we know about SodaStream, right? And then there's Boeing and Hewlett-Packard, and of course there's Caterpillar, because Caterpillar, whose products are used by the Israeli military, we will never forget that it was a militarized Caterpillar bulldozer that took the life of Rachel Corrie. G4S is especially important because it participates directly in the maintenance and reproduction of repressive apparatuses in Palestine. So we're talking about prisons, checkpoints, the apartheid wall. G4S represents the growing insistence on what is called security under the neoliberal state, and the ideologies of security that bolster not only privatization of security, but the privatization of imprisonment and the privatization of warfare. It is responsible, G4S is responsible for the repressive treatment of political prisoners inside Israel. And of course, through Adamir, we have learned about the character of the imprisonment that is faced by so many Palestinians, but also about their hunger strikes and other forms of resistance. G4S is the largest security corporation in the world. It's also the third largest private corporation in the world. Third only in relation to, you know, the first one, right? What is the largest private corporation in the world? Walmart. What's the second one? Foxconn. Absolutely right. And what's the third one? G4S. G4S has insinuated itself into our lives under the guise of security and the security state, from the way Palestinians experience political incarceration to racist technologies of separation and apartheid from the wall in Israel, to prison-like schools in the US, to the wall along the US-Mexico border. G4S brings sophisticated technologies of control to prisons in Israel, like Hashran prison, which includes children among its prisons, and Damon prison, which incarcerates women as well. But I think it's important for us to recognize that it is involved in education in the US as well. Yes, we can go on and on, but I was impressed because I was looking at a website by the name of Great Schools, because I was doing some work on education, and I came across a school in Florida that is called Central Pasco Girls Academy in Land O'Lakes, Florida. And what you learn is that it is a small alternative public school. But then when you look at the facilities page of the G4S website, you discover this entry, because that school belongs to G4S. Central Pasco Girls Academy, Lanza Lake, Florida, serves 32 moderate-risk females aged 13 to 18 who have been assessed as needing intensive mental health services. And so when you consider that the process of producing mental health has been given up entirely, and as a matter of fact, the two largest psychiatric institutions in this country are Cook County Jail in Chicago and Rikers Island in New York. Now, when you consider that and you realize that G4S is involved in this girls' school, and they indicate that they use gender-specific treatment, addressing sexual abuse, substance abuse, domestic violence, trauma, and if this security company is going to be responsible for addressing issues of intimate violence and substance abuse, you can be sure that those social problems will be with us forever, because they're about reproducing them. In the UK, I learned that G4S operates rape crisis centers. Now, this is a security corporation, a corporation that owns and operates prisons all over the country, a corporation that provides transportations, talking about immigrant detention centers, that provides transportation for immigrants who are being deported from the US to Mexico, and thus colluding with the repressive immigration legislation. And you might know that there have been more immigrants deported during the Obama administration than ever before. G4S also deports people in the UK to Africa, to Angola, for example. And there was the case of Jimmy Mubanga, who died a terrifying death while being restrained by G4S guards in his airplane seat. They belted and handcuffed him behind his back, and because he was talking, they used what they call the karaoke hold. And it's like a weird name, karaoke hold. They push the head of the prisoner into the seat in front of him. This was on a British Airlines plane. And they held him there for something like 40 minutes. And this took place in front of the passengers, in front of the crew, and no one intervened. By the time the ambulance service arrived, he was dead. Of course, I was also planning to mention that Ademir and BDS has called upon the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to divest its 120 million? 170 million stake in G4S. Now, this egregious treatment of undocumented immigrants from the US to the UK compels us, I think, to make connections with Palestinians who are transformed into immigrants, indeed undocumented immigrants on their own ancestral lands. Companies like G4S provide the technical means of carrying out this process. when I visited Palestine in 2011, our delegation met with many organizations, political organizations, academic groups, universities, women's organizations, BDS, and those were absolutely amazing meetings. And I'll never forget when Omar Barghouti said to us, "We are not asking you to do anything extraordinary. We're not asking you to do anything heroic. We are simply asking you not to be complicit with the crimes of the state of Israel." That's the very least we can do. We also had a very interesting meeting with Queers for BDS. And some of us joined the panel that Queers for BDS organized at the World Social Forum Justice for Palestine in Brazil last year. And of course, you're familiar with pinkwashing, right? And the attempt to represent the state of Israel as the most democratic state of the region, drawing on its connection with the US, but also using strategies of pinkwashing to bolster this false notion of democracy. Israel is supposed to be the best place for women and for LGBTQ communities. But of course, we have to ask, which women? There's, again, this universal category that hides racism within it. And we have to ask, which LGBTQ communities? Certainly not Palestinian. The pinkwashing effect covers over the carceral repression. And the work that Queers for BDS have done has pointed out the extent to which justice is invisible. You cannot say that you want justice for LGBTQ communities and at the same time subject Palestinians to the kind of absolute repression that is associated with the occupation of Palestine. So my time is just about up. I just want to say before I end that when I've described the segregation in Palestine that so clearly mirrors the historical apartheid racism in the US, and when I've spoken to Black audiences, the response has almost inevitably been, why has no one told us this before? Why don't we know this? Why don't we know about the signs on the highways leading from one settler community to another? Why don't we know about the signs in Hebron that prevent Palestinians from walking down certain streets? Just as we say never again with respect to the fascism that produced the Holocaust, we also need to say never again with respect to apartheid. In South Africa, of course, never again to apartheid in South Africa and in the southern US, but this also means first and foremost, that we have to expand and deepen our solidarities with the people of Palestine, who are experiencing the technologies and the practices and the regimes of apartheid inside occupied Palestine. And so we say to the people of Palestine, people of all genders, sexualities, people inside and outside prison walls, people inside and outside the wall, we say, free all Palestinian political prisoners, abolish the prison industrial complex, justice for Palestine, and yes, Palestine will be free. Thank you.
Noura, can you speak on the misrepresentation of the peace accords in the US media and among Americans? Oslo Accords, Camp David, and so on.
Oh, like in just 2 minutes? So the peace process has been presented as the only solution, that we have to have a political solution to this condition. And it's true, I agree we have to have a political solution, but the problem is that you cannot negotiate when Palestinians have absolutely no political leverage, right? You have the most powerful state in the Middle East, the fourth largest nuclear power in the world, right? Israel has been a state since 1948. With the Palestinians who are stateless, dispersed, without any kind of military capability, zero negotiating leverage, who are dependent on international donor aid, primary amongst them is the United States, for mere survival. And so what the peace process has done since 1993 has created a false sense of parity between two sides, which aren't two sides. It's a state and a stateless people. It's an oppressor and an oppressed population. It's an occupier and an occupied. But created a sense of false parity using suits and tables, mostly men, of course, who have been subject to endless negotiations with absolutely no dependable terms of reference. The Declaration of Principles, which basically established the Oslo Accords in 1993, is an agreement to agree. There are no principles in it. There is no reference to international law. In fact, 59% of the East Jerusalem settlements, according to the Oslo Accords, are legal. So when Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu says, these aren't settlements, these are Jewish neighborhoods, he's actually right, according to the Oslo Accords. But according to international law, they're contravention of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, contravention of Article 8 of the Rome Statute, and therefore war crimes, right? They can go to the ICC for this, for the International Criminal Court, and yet under Oslo, this is all perfectly legal. Even the disparate access to water is enshrined in the Oslo Accords under Article 40, as opposed to being according to international law, which would distribute water 50-50. Instead, the main access, the main water source for Palestinian, which is the Western Aquifer in the West Bank, 60% of it runs through the West Bank. Israel derives 80% of its yield for its population, for its settler population, leaving 20% for the rest of the Palestinian population. And under Oslo, that's legal. Okay, so why would Palestinians be engaged in this then for 2 decades now, over 2 decades? We're in 2014, we're 21 years. Why do Palestinians stay in this? Well, because the US has provided the Palestinians with its only means of survival. Today, 40% of the Palestinian population is dependent on that international donor aid for survival. As a result of Fayyadism, since 2007 to 2009, they've also introduced neoliberal models in the West Bank. And now Palestinians are not only under occupation, dependent on a bloated public sector, but are also heavily in debt because of new credit lines that were introduced. So the only way to shake out of the peace process would be to shake off the US. And Palestinians can do it, and Palestine has done it. The Palestinian leadership, which by the way is defunct and illegitimate, President Mahmoud Abbas is not president. He's over, his presidential mandate ended in 2009. He extended it by presidential decree to 2010. Since 2010, he's led without a mandate. But the US wants him there, so he stays. And he's treated as a president the world over. But when this leadership wanted to, it did resist twice so far, and not adequately. Once in 2012 at the UN General Assembly when it pushed ahead for recognition for an upgrade in status to a non-voting member state of the United Nations, and last week when it signed 15 international agreements in the face of a crumbling peace process. But to seriously get out of this, one, Palestinians need to shake off Oslo. They also need to get rid of a very illegitimate and corrupt Palestinian Authority, and that means also getting rid of the US and finding alternatives. And one of the best alternatives, I would say, is in a new international alliance between Britain, Russia, India, and China, although of course now with new geopolitical concerns in Ukraine and the tensions between Russia and the US, this has become even more untenable.
What is the place of feminism in the struggle for prisoners from Palestine to the US? And both Noura and Angela, what advice do you have for the generation of young women dedicated to resistance, liberty, and justice?
What is the place of feminism in the
struggle for prisoners from Palestine to the US?
Well, that might be the beginning of a very long conversation. Let me say that oftentimes we think of feminism as this very narrow concern. And certainly this is how I once thought of feminism. I assumed that it was largely about the advance of women who had already reached the top of the hierarchy but simply couldn't penetrate the glass ceiling. And certainly there are those who call themselves feminists who are only trying to participate in the leadership of a process that is exploitative and repressive. But that is not the feminism I associate myself with. There are multiple feminisms. The kind of feminism that I think is helpful in developing an approach that links mass incarceration in Palestine and the US is, first of all, it's an anti-racist and anti-imperialist, anti-settler colonial feminism. And second of all, it's an approach, it's a methodology. It's yes, concerned with gender, but not only with gender. It's concerned with women, but not only with women. For me, feminism represents a method of representing intersectionalities, and not only intersectionalities with respect to identities, but intersectionalities with respect to issues and struggles. And so, therefore, the attempt to make the connections between mass incarceration in Palestine and mass incarceration in the US is a feminist approach. connecting things that often appear on their face to be separate and unrelated, but also oftentimes disarticulating things that are held so closely together that we can't see the possibility of thinking of them separately. And for that example, I like to use the whole notion of crime and punishment. You know, crime, punishment. Well, punishment is about a great deal more than crime, and the assumption is that it's a consequence. There's a causal relationship, so it's a consequence of crime. But punishment is related to political repression, as we see. Punishment is very much related to class exploitation. It's related to racism. It's related to, when one considers that in the US, trans people are much more likely to be arrested and imprisoned than any other group of people in the society. So what we do is we re-articulate punishment with all of these other issues. And to me, that's what feminism helps us to do.
So the second and related question was, what advice do you have for the generation of young women dedicated to resistance, liberty, and justice?
Well, you can answer that. You can talk to your peers.
Oh man, that's a compliment. Thank you. I was just thinking, dang, I'm no longer in that category. No, I appreciate that. This is so. When I heard.
Well, youth is always relative.
Okay, I'm gonna be young forever. So when I first heard that question, I heard, what's the advice to young feminists? And I was thinking the same way that you were, that meant young men and women, right? Because our men are feminists, obviously, because they're part of the struggle for leading in our liberation. It's a collective struggle. So and I had a few things I wanted to say. Number one, my advice is, in all the work that we do, that we need to center and resist rape culture, right? So this idea of victim blaming constantly especially victim blaming women for the gendered violence that they endure, but victim blaming in general, that we never really hold perpetrators to account. And in the process, we end up exculpating all of our social ills. This is our fault. We've done this collectively. So in our work, to center that. The second is to also resist this desire to wait for the next male messiah to come lead us into the promised land. I cannot tell you. As a young organizer at Berkeley, I remember that I wrote a memo on gender to my peers and Students for Justice in Palestine when we launched divestment in 2001. February 6, 2001, when Ariel Sharon was elected for the second time. And I wrote a gender memo to my peers in the group on how we should better organize, because we weren't treating one another right. There was too much of this deference. There was too much of backroom dealings when boys were just hanging out and girls weren't invited, so to speak. And I got accused of plagiarizing the memo. So this is in our group, and it reminds me of what I've read. How come you all call her Angela? I can't help but say Miss Davis.
Oh no, you can call me Angela.
Can I say Miss Davis though?
No, you can say it.
That's right. That's right.
Okay.
So, doctor, things that I've read her write about, you write about not creating hierarchies of oppression, that we don't, for example, shake off the yoke of colonialism in a nationalist struggle and then deal with the patriarchy that afflicts us, but that because of these intersectionalities, that patriarchy and nationalism and other forms of oppression are so interlinked that if it behooves us not to be struggling for that liberation in tandem. Right. And we do that in the ways that we organize ourselves and not just for the world that we want to create. And so then the last thing I'll say to young men and women is that don't follow models that were created for you before you. These are mostly neoliberal models that encourage acquiescence and that encourage reproduction, as you so eloquently put, the reproduction of the same that we live without challenging it in revolutionary ways. Mm-hmm. You can pave your own path. It's lonely as you do it, and then everyone will follow. That's my advice.
I wanted to come sit closer to you all. This one's a long one, so bear with me. Collective liberation, the struggle for liberation for all marginalized people, as explained by bell hooks, details the necessity for joint struggle movements among all peoples. How do you see the connections between Palestinian hunger strikes, those at Pelican Bay and the Northwest Detention Center, and the possible spark for further movements? What advice would you give to hunger strikers at the Northwest Detention Center?
I don't know if there's any advice that I would want to give. I would simply want to express my solidarity. And when prisoners engage in hunger strike, as Noura pointed out in her presentation, they're using the only thing that they have. That is the only way that they can resist. They're using their bodies. And in many ways, they are destroying their bodies in order to make a point, in order to participate in a collective struggle. So those of us who inhabit this space we call the free world, which we all know is not nearly as free as it pretends to be, but we do have the capacity to generate solidarity. And of course, during the Pelican Bay, well, actually there's prisoners who are still involved in the hunger strike movement in California because the issue of solitary confinement has still not been resolved there. And to see the possibility of making connections between what is happening in California prisons, what's happening in detention, in the detention center in the Northwest, in Washington, and what is happening inside Israeli prisons to Palestinian prisoners. If we can make that connection, if we can encourage other people to think seriously about the links and the intersectionalities, I think that would be the best role that we might play. And let me say that all of us who are committed to Palestine solidarity, we have a special responsibility. We can't keep quiet. And oftentimes we feel comfortable in situations like this because we know that we are among friends. But most of the time we don't feel that comfortable. And we have to learn how to act even as we feel the discomfort of being in spaces that often refer to themselves, represent themselves as progressive spaces, but they're progressive on everything except Israel-Palestine. And so we really have to learn how to speak up and deal with the consequences. sometimes the consequences aren't nearly as bad as we assume they might be. But I think this is the moment to do that. And let me just say that sometimes historical moments appear and then they disappear. And if we don't do the organizing and the work to take advantage of what is possible at a particular historical moment, we may forever lose that opportunity, or at least lose it for a very long time. And I think this is a moment when the possibilities for bringing the issue of Palestine onto the agendas of all kinds of progressive struggles. And I think that really needs to be our agenda right now. Let's have meetings like this, yes, but then let's go forth and find 100 more, 1,000 more, 100,000 more, 1 million more who will stand with us when we say justice for Palestine.
Do you want to respond to this one also?
No, I have no advice to give to prisoners and hunger strikers. I salute you. I mean, I agree. Full solidarity.
Okay, the next one asks, students, faculty, and staff at U.S. universities are beginning to see the increased privatization, neoliberalization of academic institutions. Can you speak to the intersections between this trend and the repression of BDS activism on campuses? How can BDS also contribute to the larger struggle to reimagine a liberatory education in this country?
Well, I was speaking last night at Pacific University about the 50th anniversary of Freedom Summer. We have a lot of anniversaries. They started last year, and they're going to continue, right? 2015 is the sesquicentennial of the 13th Amendment, right? And then as I was saying to the crowd last night, and let's not forget that 2016 is the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Black Panther Party. And the Black Panther Party as an organization which spoke out against police crimes, it spoke out on behalf of the demand for health and housing, and it also called for international solidarities. It was opposed to all. Check out the 10-point program. Actually, last night I just read the 10-point program, and people realized, oh my God, these are the issues that we're still struggling for, 50 years later. Mm-hmm. So let's see if we can organize the 50th anniversary of the Black Panther Party. What was the question?
So the intersections.
What was it?
So
let me see. Privatization, neoliberalization of academic institutions. So the reason I raised the Freedom Summer first, okay, now it's all coming back to, I'm sorry that I'm not 100%. I'm only about 60% today, so. But the reason I was actually talking about Freedom Summer was because that was a moment when students all over the country converged on the South. I mean, it was one of the most amazing experiments in the history of this country, one of the most amazing projects. Because kids, students, went to Mississippi knowing they were going to be facing the worst kind of racist violence. But not only did they go, but they fought for the right to recruit on college campuses at UC Berkeley. And as a result of the fact that the administration kicked the recruiters off the campus and said, no, you cannot recruit UC Berkeley students to go to Mississippi, they started a free speech movement. And people like Bettina Apteca, Mario Savio, they created this massive movement that called for free speech on college and university campuses all over the country. And as a matter of fact, they won, which meant that every campus was supposed to have a free speech area. And I asked now, where is your free, I asked the president of Pacific University, so where's your free speech area on this campus? She didn't know, but the students who had demonstrated on the campus, they knew where it was, interestingly. So the reason I say this is because one can see how these struggles over the right to struggle can indeed transform the academy. And certainly with the privatization and neoliberalization of the US academy and the emphasis on individualism, possessive individualism, and we need to include this in the advice part too, to constantly struggle against individualism. And recognize that there's a difference between individuality and individualism. Because we want individuality, but we recognize that the lone individual is not the unit of our communities, of our societies. We find ourselves through our relations with each other, and therefore we have to imagine ourselves first and foremost as members of communities, of collectives, not as the bourgeois individual, the capitalist individual, the market individual. And this is what neoliberalism has done. It has so destroyed our ability to imagine ourselves in relation to each other that we think of ourselves as abstract merchants on the market, trying to buy and sell. So we even start to think of ourselves as commodities, or our education as commodities. And we talk about how we're marketing ourselves. And so, that's very dangerous language that we often just pick up and use because it's available. So, yeah. And I think the effort to repress BDS activism and justice for Palestine, Students for Justice for Palestine are doing such important work on campuses all over the country. And the very fact that Israeli Anti-Apartheid Week has spread in a relatively short period of time is an indication of, I think, the changes that are possible. So sorry for speaking so long.
Can I add to that? So I think this is a critical question because the university campus is dramatically changing. I mean, it was definitely different in Mario Savio's time and in the free speech movement, and certainly in my time and even now. But not only is the university promoting the cult of the individual, right? So how are you going to brand yourself? How are you going to monetize your time? How are you going to become the it? This is the trend that we're seeing. there's a higher opportunity cost for students to even take risks because of the cost of education. And so now you're entering into school, and it's a high risk to even consider, for example, going to school and pursuing graduate studies because of the loans that one is going to graduate with, without the guarantee of opportunity, and certainly no loan forgiveness. I mean, the university, like the medical industry, like all these things that are supposed to provide services in health and education and community, have become industries that are for-profit models. And so students that once entered and had the least to lose because they don't have necessarily, right? If we're talking about freshmen, 18 years old, they don't necessarily have families, and they don't necessarily have people to take care of, and they don't necessarily have 9-to-5 jobs, and can therefore be imaginative and take these risks and envision and push the rest of society outwards beyond where it's comfortable, because they're not in their rigid modes. Now these students have more to lose. The risks are so high. The UC Irvine students who protested Israeli Ambassador Michael Oren were suspended, and they were criminally prosecuted for their protest. How high is that risk, knowing that they can be expelled with those debts and not be able to pay them back? Now on campus, especially with BDS, these risks are incredibly high because of the way that universities are also responsive to donors and to alumni. And I say this in my experience at Berkeley, where as a result of a FOIA request, we discovered, I got to see my file, right? That letters were written about me if I, for example, wasn't settled, tamed, controlled, whatever, that donors threatened to rescind their funding. So you have universities that are also responding to this, and most recently at Northeastern, the SJP was banned on campus. I mean, talk about a restriction of free speech. 2 women of color were the only 2 prosecuted on campus and at threat of suspension, and they're basically used as a model for the rest of the nation. And so BDS is a great risk because, especially on campuses and for students, because they're doing such a great job. 6 UCs to pass divestment resolutions in the past 2 years. Oh my God, that's incredible. And without any funding, decentralized leadership. We're talking about the one place where you are literally finding organic leaders come up and rise, right? Where they're not getting awards for what they do and accolades and buttons and pins for being amazing and being honored by the Obama administration or whatnot. They're just doing it because it's right. And so I say to the BDS activists, you're taking this risk, but you're not the first ones to do that. And know that the reward is high because you are norm changers. When you do it, others are inspired to do it, not only on the question of Palestine, but on other questions from labor on campus to racial equality to issues that affect broader society. And so you have to keep on keeping and know that that's the risk that you'll be rewarded for. History will reward you for that.
Okay, so this is our last question for the night, and it's addressed to both of you. Can you each comment on how you define and stay healthy and not get overwhelmed or incapacitated and not get overwhelmed or incapacitated by the horror and challenge of confronting injustice? And what brings you joy?
Should I answer that first? Do you have the closing word? No, I want you to have the closing word. Oh, better. Okay. So I'm only going first because I would love to have Dr. Davis have the closing word. So I think that's funny. Whoever asked that question, I think that's really funny. because one, and especially for women of color, I think, have been seriously afflicted with chronic disease and have not survived the, structural violence and then the personal violence that one embodies. I think for me, if anybody heard me answering this question that really knows me, they'd, pull me off this stage, because I've been told several times, when you're sick, you gotta stay still, stop moving, da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. When you're motivated, something else moves you, right? And partly the sickness is also sweating out that residue and the things that we carry inside. And so I don't know. For me, the way that I try to stay healthy, though, and happy is learning that I fight for justice not from a place of guilt, which I used to fight for it from. I used to feel guilty all the time because I wasn't born somewhere else, under some other regime, living under some other conditions, and only fortune placed me where it did, right? And I learned to fight for justice from a place of love because I knew that that was much healthier. So that was my most revolutionary revelation. And so, the love that I had for the world, I started to love myself for it too. And take the time out to, for example, build friends outside of the movement. Oh my God! Who know nothing about this and just enjoy people, because that's what you enjoy in people. And I'll share something that we haven't actually made public yet, but something that I've learned to derive joy from is family. And I come here as a new mama and learning to find space for that. And that is revolutionary, and no one can take that away from me, and I'm so grateful to come to that realization.
Well, it's kind of ironic that I have to speak about this issue in my current state. But I can tell you that normally I do take care of myself. And this is only something that I came to recognize the importance of doing after many, many years of running myself into the ground, of sleeping 3 hours a night. And it's just that last week I did spend 2 days where I only got 3 hours of sleep, and then I got this terrible cold. But normally this doesn't happen. And I do take seriously the importance of incorporating self-care into our commitment to struggle. If we don't take care of ourselves, how can we even model what it is we're trying to struggle for? So I'm really, this is something that I like to talk about because I like to talk about caring for the body, but also caring for the spirit. And I'm a person who does a lot of exercise. I have a whole long history of all of the physical things that I've done that would take too long to share with you. So, I can say that I'm a person who does yoga and I meditate. And I also am attentive to my eating practices. And I think that as someone, I just celebrated my 70th birthday in January. And I'm doing really well. Except I have to turn this off so I can but I think that this is something that we have to encourage, because otherwise what happens is that people get involved for a minute, and then they get burnt out, and then they drop it. And for me, it's not about figuring out how to accomplish this immediate goal. It's about how to craft a lifetime of struggle. And so therefore, when you become involved, you have to figure out how to maintain your passion. So it means that you've got to be able to find joy in the movement as well. And yeah, you can search for it outside, but the work itself has to be able to bring you pleasure. And so it means that it's not all about these serious activists who do nothing except print leaflets out and distribute them and sit in meetings for half the night, and people who can be really boring, you know? And like Emma Goldman said, if I can't dance, I don't want your revolution. And I think that's a nice way to conclude. Thank you very much.